At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, a B-17 Flying Fortress named Rikki-Tikki-Tavi pushed deep into hostile German airspace. The sky over northern Germany was already thick with black flak bursts and streaks of tracer fire. But inside the bomber, 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran was focused on only one thing: the empty sky behind him. Moran was the tail gunner, seated alone at the very back of the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew by more than 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. His world consisted of a narrow compartment, a bicycle-style seat, an oxygen mask frosting over with ice, and two 50 caliber machine guns pointed straight into death's most dangerous direction. Moran was a farm boy from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, raised on a dairy farm where hard work and silence were part of daily life. Like many young men of his generation, he had watched aircraft cross the sky and dreamed of flight. When he turned 18, he enlisted immediately. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with fast reflexes, steady nerves, and experience handling firearms. Farm boys fit the profile perfectly. Training taught Moran how to track fast-moving fighters, calculate lid angles, compensate for wind and altitude, and fire in short bursts to prevent his guns from overheating. He memorized enemy silhouettes until he could identify a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 at over 2,000 yards. But no amount of training could truly prepare him for combat over Germany. The 8th Air Force had sent more than 300 bombers on that day's mission. Their target was Bremen, one of Germany's most heavily defended industrial cities. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens. Bremen was vital to the German war machine, and the Luftwaffe knew it. By the time Moran's formation reached the target, German defenses had already shot down 6 flying fortresses. The loss rate for bomber crews was catastrophic. 2 months earlier, the Schweinfurt mission had cost 60 bombers in a single day, 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. Crews called deep missions into Germany milk runs to hell. Statistically, a bomber crew needed to complete 25 missions to go home. Most didn't make it past 15. The B-17's defensive doctrine relied on tight formations. Bombers flew close together in boxes, overlapping fields of fire to deter enemy fighters. The theory was sound. The reality was brutal. Flak bursts tore through multiple aircraft at once. Damaged bombers struggled to stay in formation, and any aircraft that fell behind became an immediate target. As Rikki-Tikki-Tavi approached Bremen, anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The bombers had to fly straight and level during the bomb run, unable to maneuver while German gunners zeroed in. Moran watched another B-17 ahead of them take a direct hit. The aircraft folded in half and vanished into the clouds below. There was no time to process it. Moments later, their own bombs were released, 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories beneath them. The mission objective was complete. Survival was now the only goal. As the formation turned back toward England, disaster struck. A burst of flak slammed into Rikki-Tikki-Tavi's No. 2 engine. The propeller windmilled uselessly, and the bomber began losing speed. In bomber combat, a damaged aircraft lagging behind the formation was effectively already dead. German fighter pilots waited for stragglers. A lone B-17 without the protection of massed defensive fire was easy prey. Moran saw the fighters climbing toward them. Messerschmitts rising from below. Focke-Wulfs diving from above. A dozen aircraft at least, circling like predators. The first attack came from the 6 o'clock low position directly behind and beneath the bomber, the most vulnerable angle. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and squeezed the triggers. His twin machine guns erupted, tracers streaking through the cold air. One German fighter broke off, rolling away, but others immediately took its place. The Luftwaffe pilots were professionals, veterans of years of combat. They attacked in coordinated pairs, one drawing fire, the other lining up a killing shot. Moran swung his guns constantly, tracking targets as spent shell casings piled around his knees. The temperature at 24,000 feet was 43 degrees below zero. His electrically heated suit struggled to keep up. His breath froze on his oxygen mask. The guns grew dangerously hot while his fingers went numb. Cannon shells slammed into the aircraft, tearing through aluminum as if it were paper. One by one, other gun positions went silent. First one waist gunner. Then the other. The intercom dissolved into static and broken voices. Moran could not tell who was alive or dead. He only knew the attacks were not stopping. A Focke-Wulf came in from the 4 o'clock position. Moran tracked it and fired. The fighter's wing disintegrated, and it spiraled downward, trailing smoke. His first confirmed kill. He had no time to think about it. Another burst of cannon fire ripped through the tail section. Moran felt a violent impact on his left forearm, then another on his right. Both arms were shattered. Blood soaked through his flight suit. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but his hands still worked. He could still squeeze the triggers. More hits followed. Control cables snapped and whipped through the compartment. The tail section began vibrating violently. Moran glanced down at his parachute, strapped to his chest like every airman's. The fabric was shredded. Cannon shells had torn through it. If he bailed out, he would fall 4 miles to his death. The attack intensified. At least 15 fighters circled the crippled bomber. Somewhere forward, the pilot and co-pilot were dead. The flight engineer was dead. The radio operator was dead. The bull turret gunner was dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off that morning, only 2 were still alive: navigator Jesse Orison in the nose, and Eugene Moran in the tail, separated by 40 feet of destruction. Then came the sound Moran would never forget, the shriek of tearing aluminum. The aircraft lurched violently. The fuselage split just forward of the tail. Moran watched as the front half of Ricky Tikatavi wings, engines, cockpit, and crew fell away toward the German countryside below. He was alone, trapped in a severe tail section, wounded in both arms with no parachute, 24,000 feet above enemy territory. Physics offered no mercy. The tail section began to tumble, spinning end over end. Moran was thrown against the walls. Blood sprang across the compartment. He should have been paralyzed by fear. He should have waited for death. Instead, he kept fighting. German fighters closed in, curious or cautious, flying within range. Moran grabbed his machine guns. The spinning wreckage made aiming nearly impossible, but he fired anyway. Tracers arced wildly through the sky. The fighters scattered. One took hits across its fuselage and dove away, trailing smoke. Moran was falling 4 miles to certain death and still shooting. The tail section's stabilizers caught the air, creating drag. The spin slowed. The descent became almost controlled. Almost. The ground rushed closer. Fields and forests filled his vision. Moran braced himself against the steel frame, wrapping his shattered arms around ammunition boxes. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at nearly 100 miles per hour. Branches snapped, metal tore away. Then the wreckage slammed into the frozen ground. Silence followed. Eugene Moran was alive barely. He lay broken inside the wreckage. Both forearms were shattered with compound fractures. His ribs were crushed. A piece of his skull was missing, exposing part of his brain to the freezing air. The crash site lay 15 miles south of Bremen, deep in enemy territory. Hypothermia and blood loss threatened to finish what gravity had not. Moran dragged himself from the wreckage and looked up at the gray German sky. He had survived the impossible. Now he had to survive what came next. German voices echoed through the trees. German soldiers emerged cautiously from the trees, rifles raised, surrounding the shattered tail section of the bomber. Snow crunched under their boots as they stared at the American airman lying broken on the frozen ground. Eugene Moran could barely move. His arms were useless, twisted at unnatural angles, pain radiating through his body with every shallow breath. Blood had frozen into dark crusts along his flight suit. His vision blurred, but he remained conscious, aware that survival now depended not on courage, but on mercy, and mercy was never guaranteed in enemy territory. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his cries as they handled his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, and the ruined remains of his parachute. One of them muttered something in German and shook his head. To them, this was not a miracle. It was a dying enemy bomber crewman who had just helped destroy their city. An officer arrived and examined Moran's injuries. His assessment was blunt. The American was clearly dying. But orders were orders. Downed airmen were to be captured if alive. Dead men provided no intelligence. Moran was loaded onto a wooden cart, no stretcher, no blankets, no medical care. The cart jolted along frozen roads for hours. Every bump sent fresh agony through his broken ribs and arms. The wound in his skull had stopped bleeding only because the cold had frozen the blood solid. His consciousness faded in and out. He remembered being dragged into a building. He remembered lying on a concrete floor. He remembered German voices discussing him as if he were already dead. No doctor came, no morphine, no bandages. Germany's medical system was overwhelmed, and supplies were scarce. What little they had was reserved for German soldiers and civilians. An enemy airman with catastrophic injuries was not a priority. Moran lay on that concrete floor for 2 days. Infection set in quickly. His exposed brain tissue swelled. His broken arms turned dark and discolored as gangrene began to take hold. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread to his bloodstream. Death was measured in hours, not days. On the 3rd day, he was transported again. Another cart, another brutal journey. This time, his destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a converted facility used to treat wounded Allied airmen until they were either stabilized or declared beyond saving. The hospital was understaffed and poorly supplied. German doctors performed triage, deciding who was worth saving and who was not. Moran's injuries placed him firmly in the latter category. But inside that hospital were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured on the Eastern Front and forced into service. They worked with inadequate tools, little anesthesia, and almost no supplies. When they examined Moran, they made a decision that defied logic and orders. They would try to save him. Not because they were told to, not because they expected success, but because he was a wounded man and they were doctors. The surgery lasted 7 hours. There was no proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they set his shattered bones with wire and metal pins. They cleaned infected tissue from his wounds. They removed fragments of bone from his skull and covered his exposed brain as best they could. They attached a crude metal plate to his head, splinted his arms with wooden boards, and wrapped him in bandages torn from bedsheets. When it was over, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. The fever came that first night. Moran's temperature climbed dangerously high. His body shook with violent chills and burned with heat. Infection was now the enemy, and antibiotics were unavailable. The Serbian doctors stayed with him, changing bandages, forcing water between his cracked lips, pressing cold cloths against his burning skin. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He screamed warnings to crewmates long dead. He relived the moment the bomber broke apart, again and again. The other wounded prisoners listened in silence, certain they were witnessing a man's final hours. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings. He was alive. The infection had not killed him. His body had done what medicine could not. The Serbian doctors examined his wounds and saw the first signs of healing. Against all odds, Eugene Moran was going to survive. Word spread through the hospital, the American who fell 4 miles without a parachute. Guards came to stare. Other prisoners asked to hear his story. Once Moran was stable enough to move, he was transferred to a permanent Camp Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a compound designed specifically to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire, guard towers, wooden barracks, brutal winters. Thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners filled the camp, all waiting for the war to end or for death to arrive first. Moran's recovery was slow. His arms regained partial function but would never fully heal. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches. Nightmares followed him every time he slept. Still he survived. Months passed, then a year. In the summer of 1944, the Germans began transferring prisoners as Allied forces advanced. Moran was packed into cattle cars with dozens of other men. No food, no sanitation, no room to sit. Some collapsed where they stood. The worst came in the autumn of 1944, the Hell Ship. Hundreds of Allied prisoners were forced into the dark hold of an aging cargo vessel crossing the Baltic Sea. No ventilation, no light, 1 bucket for sanitation. The crossing lasted 4 days. Men died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. When the hatch finally opened, Moran emerged into daylight, barely able to stand. Another camp followed, then another. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces advanced from the east, Allied armies from the west. On February 6th, German commanders ordered a full evacuation. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march west in sub-zero temperatures. Anyone who fell behind was shot. The march would later be known as the Black March. For 86 days, Moran walked. Through snowstorms. Through frozen roads. Sleeping in barns or open fields. Drinking contaminated water. Eating raw potatoes when he could find them. Men died every day. Guards shot stragglers without hesitation. Moran put 1 foot in front of the other and refused to stop. He had survived a 4-mile fall. He would not die on a frozen road. On April 26, 1945, American soldiers intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The guards surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. After 17 months of captivity, Eugene Moran was free. He weighed 93 pounds. The army processed his case with disbelief. Shot down over Bremen. Fell 24,000 feet without a parachute. Survived captivity. Survived the Black March. Only 3 men in the entire war had survived falls of comparable distance. Moran was one of them. He received 2 Purple Hearts, an Air Medal, and an honorable discharge. He returned to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, married, raised 9 children, worked his farm. Rarely spoke of the war. The memories were too heavy. The pain never fully left. But he lived. In 2007, Wisconsin honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. A street was named Eugene Moran Way. His story was finally documented in a book titled Tailspin. Eugene Moran died in 2014 at the age of 89. The tail gunner position was the loneliest place on AB-17. On November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran occupied that position. And when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not wait for death. He kept fighting all the way down.